Here is Colorverse Rainy Day. This is a cornflower blue, and the color cornflower blue always makes me think of the movie Fight Club. There is a fair amount of tone shift as paper changes, and it does shade, but I have to say, I wish it shaded more. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the performance is okay. Nothing to write home about. Certainly not with this ink on non-fountain pen friendly paper. The tone of blue is it just isn't for me. Though it is a perfectly good blue, and the ink becomes the sort of blue that I have to pass on it. It's the idea of a bottle of it it's not for me. It's tough to always do that when you're like, but this is good. I just don't care for it.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M120. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Need that power ink to match your power tie that's cornflower blue? This might be it. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade, not hugely as I would really kind of expect of it. It does shade very well. It does show some dramatic difference between its lightest and darker spots, making a little bit of a statement when we look at statement on the second line, where the S is lighter than that first T that darkens up a little bit. The A-T-E-M-E enter a nice lighter tone. That T at the end does become a whole lot darker. Looking at the back of the page, there are a few moments that it got deeper into the paper. Now, there's no ghosting, and these spots never bled through touching the page underneath. But this does give us that warning because this is Clairfontaine and this is not normal.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Ginkgo Tree. Here is Colorverse Einstein Ring. Here is Colorverse Desert Storm.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter Notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather. It does not spread. It barely shades at all. And I'm going to say barely shades at all because it only goes from a light to a medium light tone. Though it does that frequently, the amount of shading is not a huge standout thing with this paper. Otherwise, I think the color on the page looks decent. Looking at the back of the page, we can see a lot of spots that the ink does get very deep into the paper. Now, it never bled through touching the page underneath, but it does get quite deep, which might stop you from using the back of the page.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now, the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get a tone that is just as dark as it is on the Clairfontaine, but it is much more turquoise on this paper. That turquoise means it is being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning this ink is itself a little translucent. It does feather. It feathers a fair amount in a number of spots. It does not have spread. It does have some shading. With shading comes feathering, which is really sort of a downside of what's going on. Looking at the back of the page, it really does get deep into the paper a lot. Enough to stop you from writing on the back of the page. Not the ghosting. The ghosting itself isn't a problem. It's the over-penetration, almost to the point of bleeding, but it never bled through to the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, and most importantly, it does stand out against the quad rule without any kind of problem. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting itself is not a problem. What is a problem is how deep it gets into the page and how frequently. Rhodia is a coated paper after all, so this really shouldn't happen. But none of this bled through touching the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is KWZ Iron Gall Blue number 6. Here is Noodler's Dallas, Texas Navy. Here is Parker Quink Washable Blue. Here is Robert Oster Blue Lagoon.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is the same as the Clairfontaine. We're going to ignore that spot. It has nothing to do with this review. It was from another. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade just about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, making this a very good ink to use if you're a student that regularly uses these notebooks. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. These spots, these are a mistake of some future writing that happened where the page fell over. So that's a transfer, not this ink.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Kobe number 30. Here is Diamine Golden Honey. Here is Robert Oster Opal Mauve. Here is Van Diemen Hasting Caves Shimmering Ink.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, this does not feather. This does have a slight bit of spread. My finger is covering this spot. That was from a previous review. Nothing to do with this one. I think what we're seeing here, the shading, it does offer some shading in some areas. I think this performance on this paper is pretty good. And if you were going to use this, I don't think it's a horrible choice. Looking at the back of the page, we can see that the ghosting's not a problem. Over penetrating the paper is, though none of this bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan M120 Fine Nib writes pretty wet and gives a good cornflower blue and some decent enough shading. Off camera, I tried this in a dry broad, and the tone lightened a little and the shading increased a bunch. I think the best version came from a dry medium or dry broad for the slightly lighter blue and more shading. Now go out there, make imaginary friends. Just skip the fighting with them part.